The torches along the walls had been burning for 53 nights without rest. Inside the city, no one spoke above a whisper. Mothers held their children closer than they had ever held them before. Old men who had survived plagues and famines stood frozen at their windows, listening to a sound they could not name, a low, rolling vibration in the earth, as if the ground itself were grinding its teeth. Beyond the walls, the horizon glowed orange. Not from sunset. From campfires. Tens of thousands of them, stretching farther than any eye could measure, blinking like a second sky brought down to earth. The city had a name that had once meant the center of the world. Constantinople. The jewel of empires. The bridge between continents. The capital that had stood unbroken for over 1,000 years. And tonight, on the 28th of May, 1453, every person inside its walls knew the same impossible truth. By morning, the world they had been born into would no longer exist. For more than 11 centuries, these walls had refused to fall. Armies had come. Armies had broken. Huns, Persians, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders. Each one looked at these stones and believed they could be the ones to crack them. Each one left behind only their dead. The Theodosian walls were not just stone. They were memory. They were the spine of a civilization. 3 layers thick. A moat. Towers like the teeth of a sleeping giant. Generations of children grew up believing those walls were eternal, that as long as they stood, Rome still lived. But Rome had been dying for a long time. The empire that once stretched from Britain to the deserts of Syria had shrunk into a single city. A few scattered villages. A handful of islands. The emperor who now walked the walls in silver armor ruled over what was, in truth, a ghost. His name was Constantine XI Palaiologos. And on this night, he was 48 years old, exhausted, unmarried, and almost certainly aware that he would not live to see another sunset. He had been offered a way out. The Sultan, only 21 years old, had sent envoys. Surrender the city. Walk out alive. Keep your title. Keep your wealth. Live as a vassal in the Peloponnese. Constantine had given a single answer. To surrender the city is not mine to do, nor anyone's who lives in it. We have all decided to die of our own free will, and we shall not spare our lives. That answer had been delivered weeks ago. The young Sultan had read it, folded it, and ordered the cannons rolled forward. The cannons. No one inside the city had ever seen anything like them. The largest of them, called the Basilica, was so heavy it required 60 oxen and 400 men just to drag it into position. When it fired, the sound traveled across the Bosphorus. Birds fell from the sky. Walls that had stood for 1,000 years cracked like dried clay. For weeks, the bombardment had not stopped. Stones the size of wagons came screaming over the horizon. Each impact shook the floors of the cathedrals. Each impact sent dust drifting down from frescoes painted by long-dead saints. The defenders patched the walls at night. Wood, earth, barrels filled with rubble. Anything they could find. They worked by torchlight, knowing that by sunrise, the cannons would begin again. There were not enough of them. The city that had once held 500,000 souls now held perhaps 50,000. And of those, only about 7,000 could fight. Against them stood an army of more than 80,000, possibly more, a sea of soldiers, engineers, cavalry, and the famous janissaries, the Sultan's elite, raised from childhood for one purpose only: to take this city. But there was something else the defenders feared. Something stranger than cannons. 3 weeks earlier, on a still spring morning, the lookouts on the sea walls had rubbed their eyes and refused to believe what they were seeing. Ships. Ottoman ships. Dozens of them. Sailing across dry land. The Sultan, blocked from the inner harbor by a massive iron chain, had done the unthinkable. He had ordered his engineers to build a road of greased logs across the hills behind the city. And in a single night, his fleet had been dragged, pulled by oxen and men, over land, around the chain, and into the harbor itself. The defenders woke to find enemy warships floating in waters they had believed untouchable. It was, for many of them, the moment they understood. This was not an ordinary siege. This was something history had not yet seen. And yet, they did not run. That was perhaps the most haunting thing of all. They could have fled. Some had. A handful of merchants slipped out on Italian galleys before the harbor was sealed. But the rest stayed. Greeks, Venetians, Genoese, Catalans, Cretans, even men who owed Constantinople nothing, who had no reason to die for a foreign emperor, lifted swords and climbed onto the walls beside him. A young Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani had arrived months earlier with 700 professional soldiers. He had no obligation to come. He came anyway. The emperor placed him in command of the most vulnerable section of the wall. The two men, from different worlds, fought side by side as if they had been brothers their entire lives. On this final night, the 28th of May, the bombardment stopped. The silence was worse than the cannons. It rolled across the city like a wave. People stepped out of their homes, looking toward the walls, unsure if they should feel hope or terror. The defenders on the ramparts gripped their weapons tighter. They knew what silence meant. It meant the Sultan was preparing. Inside the Ottoman camp, fires were being lit in long, deliberate lines. Drums began to beat, slow at first, then faster, layered, hypnotic. Imams walked among the soldiers, blessing them. Officers handed out final orders. Mehmed II, the young Sultan, addressed his army from horseback, promising them the wealth of the greatest city in the world. He had been preparing for this since he was a boy. He had read the histories of every general who had failed to take Constantinople. He had memorized their mistakes. He had spent sleepless nights drawing maps. He had questioned engineers, astronomers, and spies. The conquest of this city was not a dream for him. It was a destiny he had inherited the moment he could read. And now, only stones stood between him and immortality. Inside the city, Constantine did something no emperor had done in living memory. He walked. Not in procession. Not in ceremony. Just walked, through the streets of his dying capital, past shuttered shops, past families praying together by candlelight, past the broken statues of emperors who had ruled when Rome was young. He spoke to soldiers by name. He embraced commanders. He thanked foreigners who had no reason to be there. Then he entered the Hagia Sophia. For nearly 1,000 years, this cathedral had been the largest enclosed space ever built by human hands. Its dome seemed to float on light. Its mosaics shimmered with gold pressed thinner than paper. Emperors had been crowned beneath that dome. Saints had been buried there. Every important moment in the history of the Eastern Roman world had passed through its doors. On this night, it was full. Greeks and Latins, Orthodox and Catholic, people who had argued bitterly for centuries over theology, knelt together on the same marble floor. Priests chanted. Candles flickered. Old women wept silently. Soldiers came in their armor, kissed the icons, and walked back out toward the walls. Constantine took communion. Then he asked forgiveness from every man in the cathedral. From his commanders. From his servants. From strangers. He asked forgiveness for any wrong he might have done in his life. And then he left the Hagia Sophia, mounted his horse, and rode toward the walls. He would never see the inside of that cathedral again. The attack began just before midnight. It came in waves, exactly as Mehmed had planned. First, the irregulars, poorly trained, poorly armed, sent forward to exhaust the defenders and absorb their first volleys. They came screaming across the broken ground, climbing ladders into a storm of arrows and stones. They died by the thousands. The defenders, sweating in the torchlight, barely had time to breathe before the second wave came. The Anatolian regulars. Disciplined. Armored. Determined. For 2 hours, the walls held. The defenders fought with a fury that defied their numbers. Boiling oil poured from the towers. Greek fire, that ancient, terrible weapon, burned ships and men alike. Constantine moved along the walls in his silver armor, shouting encouragement, dragging wounded men back from the edge, throwing himself into the fight wherever the line bent. For a moment, a single, impossible moment, it seemed the city might survive. And then the third wave came. The Janissaries. They came in silence. No shouting. No drums. Just the rhythm of disciplined boots on broken stone. They had been trained from childhood for this exact night. They climbed where the others had fallen. They cut through exhausted defenders with terrifying efficiency. And then, in the chaos, came the moment that decided everything. A small gate, called the Kirka Porta, had been used by the defenders for sorties. In the confusion of the night, someone had left it unlocked. A handful of Ottoman soldiers found it. They slipped inside. By the time anyone noticed, an Ottoman flag was already flying from a tower above the inner wall. At nearly the same instant, Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, the emperor's brother-in-arms, was struck. Sources disagree on whether it was a crossbow bolt or a gunshot. What is certain is that he was carried from the wall, bleeding badly, and that his men, seeing their commander fall, began to retreat. Constantine begged him to return. The two men's eyes met for the last time. Giustiniani was carried to a ship. He would die at sea. Days later, far from the city he had given everything to defend. The line broke. What happened next, no one has been able to fully reconstruct. The records become fragmented. Witnesses contradict each other. But the broad shape of it is known. Constantine, seeing the walls collapse around him, removed his imperial regalia. The purple cloak. The silver eagles. Anything that might mark him as the emperor. He drew his sword. And he ran toward the breach. Some say he was seen fighting beside ordinary soldiers, indistinguishable from any other man on the wall. Some say he was cut down in the first wave of the breakthrough. Some say his body was found later, identified only by the small purple eagles embroidered on his boots. Some say it was never found at all. The last Roman emperor, the heir of Augustus, of Constantine the Great, of Justinian, vanished into the smoke of his own city, sword in hand, refusing to be anything other than one of his own soldiers. By dawn, the gates were open. The Ottoman army flooded into the streets. The fighting continued in pockets, but the city had fallen. The empire that had begun in 27 BC, that had outlived the fall of the Western Roman Empire by 1,000 years, that had carried the memory of antiquity through the darkest centuries of Europe, was over. Mehmed II rode into Constantinople later that day. He was 21 years old. He went first to the Hagia Sophia. He stood beneath the dome that had crowned emperors for 1,000 years. According to the accounts, he wept, not from sorrow, but from awe. He ordered the cathedral preserved. He ordered scholars protected. He ordered the rebuilding to begin almost immediately. He took a new title that day. Caesar I Rum. Caesar of Rome. In his mind, he was not destroying an empire. He was inheriting one. But for the people inside the city, the world had simply ended. Refugees fled west, carrying manuscripts in their arms, the writings of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Euclid. Texts that Western Europe had forgotten existed. They arrived in Italy with nothing but the books they could carry. And in those books, a continent that had been sleeping for centuries began to wake up. The Renaissance, in many ways, was lit by the embers of Constantinople. Trade routes shifted. The old paths to the east were closed. European kings began to look westward, across the Atlantic, searching for new ways to reach Asia. 40 years later, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus would set sail with maps drawn, in part, from knowledge that had survived the fall of the city. The world we live in, the borders, the languages, the religions, the very shape of the modern age, was forged in the fires of that single night. And yet, when you stand today on the ancient walls of Istanbul, in the quiet hours before sunrise, something strange happens. The wind moves through the broken towers. The stones are still scarred where the cannonballs struck. The gates are still there. The Kirche Porta. The breach. The places where men died defending something they knew they could not save. And if you listen carefully, really listen, you can almost hear it. The torches. The drums. The silence before the storm. A city that refused to surrender. An emperor who chose, at the end, to be no one but a soldier. 1,000 years of history closing its eyes. Empires rise. Empires shine. Empires believe they will last forever. But every empire, no matter how golden, has a last night. And somewhere in the future, every city we know, every skyline, every flag, every monument we trust to outlive us, will have one too. The only question history ever truly asks is this: when that night comes, who will still be standing on the walls?